A year ago, almost no one expected ever to say the words President Donald Trump. But Conrad Black has known the new president for 25 years, and well before Trump even took the stage as the Republican nominee, Black wrote back in March 2016 that Trump, quote, seems to have become the man whom the great office of President of the United States now seeks. What did he know that so few others did? Conrad Black's most recent book is called Backward Glances, People and Events from Inside and Out, and we're pleased to welcome him back to our studio for a forward glance at America's 45th president. Nice to have you back here again.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Let's quote you to you as we get started here.
Let's not make a habit of it.
Well, we'll do it a couple of times. 2 weeks into Donald Trump's presidency, you wrote a column in which, after praising Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt and Nixon and Reagan for being the right president for the right time, you wrote this: Trump set himself the goal of routing all the declinists and banishing the sophistry and intellectual corruption of a failed elite, enfeebled by protracted incumbency. Of course, Trump isn't remotely as suave a personality as the other presidents mentioned, but his task is different, and it will require an overpoweringly energetic and pugnacious person to accomplish it. What is the task that you think he is so right for the times for?
A massive clean-out of the power structure in Washington. It had become a terrible sleaze factory, an immense pay-to-play casino, the deterioration of the ethics of campaign financing and of lobbying, and the transformation of the life of legislators into one of endless fundraising, often in ethically questionable circumstances, and a monopoly of the bipartisan system, essentially by the Bush and Clinton families, of whom I'm not particularly critical as individuals, and the ones in those families that I know I like personally, but that's not the issue. For 32 years in a row, one or other member of those families was president, vice president, or secretary of state, and you just can't do this in a great democracy like that, passing these great offices back and forth. And Donald Trump was running against all the factions of both parties, practically all the media, most of academia, the entire entertainment world, most of Wall Street, and the polling organizations. He thought the whole thing was a stitch-up and essentially a kind of unrepresentative infestation of the powerful in Washington, not answerable to or even particularly aware of the national interest.
You could say,
now, that would be an exaggeration, but there was a very substantial element of truth in it, and the subsequent voters legitimized that view.
You could say, though, that he's not exactly what central casting had in mind for the role, in as much as he has his own ethical challenges. He is a billionaire playboy from New York City. I mean, the list could go on. He's not a literate man.
I think he's been quite faithful to his wives. He's certainly
Listen
been a
to the
playboy.
way you just said that.
No, I think he's been a playboy at times when he's not married, but I think he's been relatively faithful to his wives. Now, by the way, no one knows what goes on in someone else's marriage, and I don't think it has anything to do with being president. So I don't care particularly.
Okay, but if you were going to go to central casting for the kind of person who would handle the role you just described, I'm not sure too many people would have come up with him.
No, you'd get more of a Jimmy Stewart figure or something. I quite agree with you, but. You know, Abraham Lincoln wasn't central casting's model to save the Union and emancipate the slaves. Richard Nixon wasn't central casting's model to reorient foreign policy and begin the serious de-escalation of the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan was much reviled as a witless actor when he came into office, and he's proved to be a candidate for Mount Rushmore.
He had at least been governor of California. This guy has been nothing. Not elected dog catcher ever.
But you were missing the point, Steve.
Okay.
That is precisely one of his strengths. He has been something. He's run a business very successfully, and not a genteel business. I mean, a rough, tough business with these developers and the building trade unions all around the U.S. and elsewhere, and the casino business. They're tough businesses, and he's a tough man. He's not a lawyer. He's not a political scientist. He's not some guy who decided in high school, I'm going to be president, and his whole life was dedicated to achieving that goal. He is a man who's had a proper career. Now, not a world historic career like Dwight D. Eisenhower had, but still a proper full career.
You talk about the egregious failings of, if I may put it this way, your fellow elitists, since I think you're part of the elite, Can I say that?
Yeah. You may characterize me as part of it, but I don't feel as an elitist myself
Fair
or think
enough.
as one.
What are the most egregious failings you think he needs to clean up?
Well, I referred to some of them. I mean, the fact is, healthcare is a shambles. Education is a shambles. The foreign policy latterly has become a tragicomic. I mean, George W. Bush was too much of an interventionist, and President Obama was a kind of pixie, imagining you could just wave a wand and your enemies became your friends. I mean, his foreign policy was America's enemies and friends will just change roles and places. I mean, it was nonsense. It was a fantasy land. And the country has lost 10% of its workforce. In the Obama years, it increased the national debt by 125% on where it had been after 233 years of independence. In 8 years, 125% increase to get 1 to 2% economic growth on a workforce that had shrunk by 10% involuntarily. I mean, you have to get the country, to use the old jargon, moving again.
You have to, and you are content to turn over the foreign policy establishment to a guy who thinks Vladimir Putin's okay. That's a long
In the way
pause.
he means that, I have no problem with it. I mean, what he means is that he's an authoritarian Russian leader in the Russian tradition, but he's a man you can deal with. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. Look, if you're trying to make the point, or indeed making the point, that Donald Trump is not, as you put it, or a phrase similar to this, whatever you exactly said, what a typecaster would send you as a great reformer. I agree with that. He isn't, but that's not how politics works. It throws up who it throws up. And in a peculiar way, he is the ideal person for this because Jimmy Stewart, I mean, the characters he played, couldn't do this job. This job requires a very tough man, not tainted by the dilution of his motivations by years in politics and climbing the greasy pole and back scratching and log rolling in the Congress and so forth. I mean, he comes right out of nowhere, as you say, and he doesn't owe any of them anything, and he is a new broom, and they need a real house cleaning in that place.
Well, let's take his expression and put it to you. He wants to make America great again. Mm-hmm. What does a great America after 4 or 8 years of Donald Trump, in your view, look like?
Has a universal health care system that works, has a fiscal balance that is acceptable and sustainable and fulfills President George Washington and the other founding fathers' requirement of a reliable and strong currency, is generating jobs and is reoriented towards this very difficult era where we have to deal with the implications of the fact that technological advance tends to create unemployment rather than jobs, and has demarcated the national interest of the United States in the world at, roughly speaking, a midpoint between George W. Bush's rather feckless interventionism and Barack Obama's unpredictable isolationist tendencies, coupled with an eccentric view of how to conduct relations with both traditional rivals and traditional allies, i.e., where we have a revived Western alliance. And I thought he hasn't been president very long, but the most important thing he said so far was when Mrs. May, the British Prime Minister, visited him, and he said that a strong and independent Britain is a blessing to the world. He's right, and he recognizes that. No, I mean,
and that blessing to the world won't let him speak in their parliament.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, that's the fact.
No.
They have not invited. He's going over there. They're not permitting him to speak, saying it's not an honor that everybody gets, and apparently he's not.
Well, you're talking about speaking in Westminster Hall. You're slightly misleading your viewers here, Steve. The people who've spoken in Westminster Hall are very few. General de Gaulle did, General Eisenhower did, President Reagan did, just 2 or 3 others. It's quite an order that a president coming to the UK for the first time doesn't speak there.
So we shouldn't read too much into that.
No, and when you say they won't allow it, I wouldn't be so bold as to say they won't allow it ever in the next 4 or 8 years. That he's not being asked to do it on his first visit as president is not a slight to him and nothing to be concerned about.
I noticed on your list of healthcare, fiscal balance, jobs, a foreign policy in the national interest, I noticed sort of improved harmony among blacks and whites, men and women. All of that is not on the list. And maybe I'm reading between the lines, but so far most people are predicting that all of that is going to be much worse off with Donald Trump as president. What's your thought?
No, I don't think it will be. I just want to go back to that business about speaking in Parliament. They invited General de Gaulle to speak in 1959. They knew him well. He lived there for years during the war. General Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander in the West. I mean, they knew him. That they don't put Donald Trump after a few months as president in the same category is absolutely nothing to get excited about. Okay. Now, to go to your question, I didn't mention that because that was not how I construed your earlier question. And I disagree with the view that he is going to be the author of permanent divisiveness of a uniquely acrimonious kind. I think that is not the case. He has gone to war against the entire political establishment. He's storming Babylon, if you will. They have resisted him. His opponent in the late election had absolutely no argument for the re-election of the Democrats to a third consecutive term. There was no argument to justify that. So the only argument they had was to attack Trump, and he counterattacked, and they were both target-rich environments, to put it in Pentagonese. The Clintons had various financial and, in Bill Clinton's case, moral predicaments to deal with, and Donald Trump has the problems you described at the outset. I mean, there are questions about him. But the Democratic Party now is gradually, and in part because of the skillful tactics Trump is employing, becoming a peculiar coalition between militant African Americans and the very poor on the one side, and the entertainment industry and elements of the sort of limousine liberal rich on the other. And the old Republican Party is being transformed into a vehicle that is embracing practically the entire working class, middle class, and part of the upper income area. And the Democrats are mindlessly charging into a cul-de-sac. But because Trump is assaulting the entire political establishment of the country in both parties, the Bushes and the Clintons and the Obamas have left Washington 45 years after the first arrival of a Bush there, or a Bush now living. I'm not going back to Prescott Bush. Mm-hmm. Because of that, this war is going on between the new president and the remaining elements that he has challenged. And I think the Democrats are making a mistake conducting what one of their leaders called a scorched earth policy. They're obstructing him at every level and trying to provoke him. And as an example of that, in this 90-day partial immigration ban, I believe that they got this jumped up federal judge in Seattle. It was absolutely no jurisdiction in the world to purport to tell the president of the U.S. how he can regulate immigration at every entry point.
A Bush appointee.
Yeah, please. So, John Paul Stevens was appointed by Gerald Ford as a conservative and was the most left-wing judge in American history. Harry Blackmun was appointed by Mr. Nixon as a conservative. He was Warren Burger, the Chief Justice's best man at his wedding. He ended up being a leftist. Byron White was appointed by President Kennedy, Justice Gorsuch's mentor, and he ended up being a conservative, and he was appointed as a liberal. I mean, once they're in these life sinecures, they're apt to do anything. But the fact is, a Seattle federal district judge has no standing whatsoever to decide what will be done at every entry point in the United States for outsiders. But I think that this is mind reading now, but the Democrats assumed. They bought into the Trump caricature and assumed that he would react like a fighting bull after being stabbed by the picador and charge and just ignore it by President Andrew Jackson saying the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. His party controlled the Congress. In fact, there's nothing anyone can do about it. This judge has no standing to do this. But he has outsmarted them. He's going through this ludicrous judicial charade, which presumably will continue till they get to a serious court, which would be the Supreme Court. And he is complying exactly with all this nonsense. And the Democrats are going to end up debating with the courts the measure will be legitimized because the president certainly has the right to do it. There's no real doubt about that, whether you like it as policy or not. And all of these demonstrations and all this absurd overreaction, as if he was setting up death camps or something, instead of delaying for 90 days the entry into the U.S. of people from some severely terrorism-afflicted countries. All of this will ultimately redound to the disbenefit of the Democrats.
Let's play a clip. You've been here before. There's no reason why you should remember this, but I remember this very well. You were the first ever guest on this program when we first aired 10.5 years ago.
Good grief.
And we talked about what it takes to be a good president. And I think we should play Conrad Black from 10.5 years ago and then come back and chat again. If you would, Mr. Director.
He's seen as a bit sort of a plucky chap, you know.
He's so not like you, though. I mean, you're an intellectual guy, and he's really not. Yet you admire him anyway.
What you say about me is flattering, but in his... That isn't the only way to be a good president. I mean, Harry Truman was a good president. He was a good writer, too. He was more of an intellect than he's given credit for commonly. But, you know, Bush is not a stupid man. No, he's not a tremendously intellectually curious man. I agree with that. But you don't absolutely have to be that in order to be a good president.
You know Hillary.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What do you think her chances are of becoming president?
Well,
in 2
no
years?
one agrees with me, but I think they're not bad. I think she's the only star that the Democrats have, and I think she'd be a strong campaigner. Now, whenever I say that, even people who are quite favorable to her tend to think that, well, there'd be too much resistance to her because she's seen as a tough woman, or she's got, you know, she's been too far on the left in the past, or so. I don't know. I mean, I think she'd be a pretty effective campaigner.
Good president, though?
He has the moral authority and the intelligence for it, would work hard.
And got 3 million more votes more than the other guy. So here's the question. You pointed out in that clip there, you weren't 100% comfortable with the lack of intellectual curiosity of George W. Bush. And I'm going to ask you sort of a follow-up on that about Donald Trump, which is, are you not sometimes embarrassed by the stuff he does?
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, he's infelicitous at times. I know. Look, you take him as he is, you know, all in all. Excuse me, I wish he was a little more dignified sometimes.
And he won against a woman who has lots of intellectual curiosity, I mean, for all of her failings.
I didn't say Donald has no intellectual curiosity. I think his intuition is good and his policy judgment is good. And I think the program that he proposes is very imaginative, and it will be adopted, and it will make a difference, and a positive difference.
I must tell you, the question I get most frequently when I'm on the street, on the subways, wherever, is I saw Conrad Black defending Donald Trump, and how does a guy who's so well-mannered and so intellectual and an author and a historian, et cetera, highly educated, defend a guy like that? What's the answer to that?
They're drinking the Kool-Aid. They're buying into the image. Since Trump is attacking most of the media in the U.S., they are, and they're overtly hostile to him and not making a pretense of covering him fairly. So they're just presenting a caricature as best they can, and he replies on social media and using the office, the great office that he holds. But the Canadian media tend to parrot the American media. After all, this guy's their president, so they just do what their analogs in the U.S. do. But it isn't him. I mean, if you actually know him, he is a very courteous, soft-spoken, polite man, a brilliant raconteur, very entertaining, likable man. And not that, again, I care particularly, but he's never coarse or vulgar, unlike Mrs. Clinton, who I also like as a person.
How can you say
but
he's
every
never
third
coarse
word is the F word with her.
How could you not? I've never heard Hillary Clinton use the F word, but I have surely heard Donald Trump say some pretty appalling things about women when he was surreptitiously taped on a bus with Billy Bush. Now, you got to grant that.
It was a regrettable episode, and he's apologized for it.
You don't think it was a sort of indication of what his true character is
It has
like?
nothing to do with being president. And, well, you and I aren't like this, Steve. A huge number of men talk like that, and let's not deceive ourselves.
Well, let me put this to you, because you may have heard he does love the Twitter.
Look, I knew Lyndon Johnson too, and he was an enormously entertaining man. But he was the most foul-mouthed person I have ever met, not excluding my days in Australia. And if 1 minute of Lyndon Johnson in any waking hour was put on a tape today, it would disqualify the utterer of those words from ever holding a job, let alone the highest job in the country.
Here is real Donald Trump tweeting at you, in which he says, at Conrad M. Black, what an honor to read your piece. As one of the truly great intellects and my friend, I won't forget. This was as a result of a piece you wrote in December 2015 in the National Review entitled Trump is the Good Guy. You've known him for 25 years, so you've known him probably longer and better than anybody in Canada. He stood by you when you had your dealings, your difficulties with the U.S. justice system.
He saw it for the absolute outrage that it was.
Well, what is it that you see in him that clearly nobody else does?
I had him as a business partner, and very few people, I mean, obviously many people have done business with him, but as a percentage of the population, particularly in Canada, I don't know if anyone else in the country has.
This is in Chicago?
Yeah, so we owned the Sun-Times newspaper, and we had a low-rise building at a downtown address, ripe for development. It was right behind the Wrigley Tower. So we put it out for bids, and his company won. And my American director said, watch it, he's a scoundrel, hang on to your wallet, and so forth. We were very careful. He produced a brilliant design, much praised by the local architectural authorities. In Chicago, the city of Frank Lloyd Wright and so on takes these things very seriously. Very fine-looking downtown district, as you know. And he came in right on budget, right on time, and had filled the place with first class paying 10 and 6 months before it opened. He was the best partner I ever had. Now, not everyone has seen that, but that is an aspect of it. And then you mentioned that he was very supportive of me through my legal travails. Not everyone passed that test either. I mean, many people did, but some people didn't. And then when you actually know him and sit and talk with him and have dinner with him and so on, which very few people in this country would have had the occasion to do. He is, in fact, not self-obsessed. I mean, he's certainly a considerable ego. There's no doubt about that.
Narcissist?
But I think not. I don't think he admires himself physically particularly. But he's always interested in you. He talks himself, but he listens to you. I mean, to whoever he's with, you see, and he's a wonderful raconteur. He's a very entertaining man. He has a terrific sense of humor. Now, I sometimes don't recognize the Donald Trump I know in this bombastic and sometimes tasteless public figure. And I understand how it's confusing for people, and I guess it is often the case that a public personality is quite different from from how they are as individuals.
Well,
indeed, to a very slight degree, it's a minuscule business. I'm not comparing myself with these great office holders, but I suffered from that myself. You may also, for all I know. You're a well-known public figure, though it seems to me you come across on TV pretty much as the very charming, courteous man you are.
I'm going to get us back on track here, Lord Black, which is to
but
say,
I mean, these things happen. It's easy to misunderstand public figures.
But had you two not known each other for 25 years, and your sole impression of the man was what you see, hear, and read in the media, would you be as bullish on him as you are?
Not quite, no, because I just obviously wouldn't have the experience you just sliced away. But I would be more positive than most people are, because what he's done is so astonishing. It has never happened in American history that a person has come from never having held a public office or any military command and been elected president. It has never happened before.
It's unprecedented.
It has never happened that someone has essentially set up a third party, used it to take over one of the parties, and actually won. You've had independence before, but it never gets you to the White House. Even Theodore Roosevelt is an ex-president. He defeated the Republicans, but he couldn't defeat the Democrats when he ran as an independent for president. It's absolutely astounding. He paid for his own campaign, and he defeated them all, everybody, and it's a great achievement. Now, that doesn't mean he'll be a good president, but having got to that level, I would say it would be hazardous to underestimate him and just assume that he's the coarse buffoon that he's generally represented as.
I'll show you one fella who doesn't underestimate him at all. In fact, I'll show you one fella who is terrified about what a Trump presidency could foretell, and he's not a flaming left liberal. He's your friend and fellow conservative David Frum, who was on this program last night. We're going to play a clip from that. Go ahead, Sheldon, roll it, please.
I think we may need to face up to the fact that true conservatism, so-called, as we've known it since from the 1970s to the 2010s, that may be a chapter. And we may now, many of the truths that we believed in then remain true, but the particular formula and arrangement may be out of date. The Republican world, I think, basically divides into four camps. The smallest camp are those who truly and sincerely believe in Donald Trump. The next smallest camp are those who truly and sincerely oppose Donald Trump. The two largest camps are those who hope for things from him and those who fear things from him. And those two right now are in coalition, and they are working to enable him. And so long as Donald Trump is able to offer Paul Ryan the hope that he can achieve things, offer others like Paul Ryan fear that he will punish them, he will be dominant within the party. And presidents then reshape conservatism reshape their parties, reshape their causes the way they think. The Democratic world is a very different place after Barack Obama than it was before. The Republican world will be even more different after Donald Trump than it was before.
Are you in the first camp, true believer?
No.
Not quite?
No. I true believer would.
That's too much.
I would be shortchanging myself. I'm a believer, but a vigilant believer, where instead of blind faith, we have qualified belief supplemented by hope.
Are you concerned about what Donald Trump may do to the Republican Party that you knew and presumably at one time believed in?
I believe in both those parties. No, I think he's not going to fragment the party. I think it needed a shaking up, and I think he's done quite a skillful job of conciliating people who were very hostile to him. David Frum is an old and dear friend of mine, as his parents were, and I will not say anything negative about him. But on this issue, we have a thorough parting of the ways. I didn't disagree with anything he said in that clip you said, but you must remember David was a Reaganite, except he then wrote a book saying that Reagan wasn't conservative enough. And he's now moved well to the left himself. He's been moving around. Nothing wrong with that.
As his sister,
but his
the senator,
perspective
says,
moves around.
His sister, the senator, says David is getting in touch with his inner moderate, which he may very well be. But he's also very concerned that this president is leading America down an authoritarian path. Do you see that?
No,
you see any of that?
That's complete rubbish. No one leads America down an authoritarian path.
He says
the
it's
most
not gonna...
authoritarian president they've ever had was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And, and as he said to Mr. Churchill, when Mr. Churchill said he'd have to consult with the king and the party leaders in his coalition and the heads of the dominions, including Canada, and he said, and I imagine you'll have some consulting also. And he said, well, I am the chief of state. I'm the head of the government. My party controls both houses of the Congress, and I've appointed 7 of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, and I don't do a lot of consulting.
That's power.
Yeah, but he didn't abuse it. I mean, it was all to good ends. But no, he is out. There's no danger whatsoever of autocracy. He has no such ambition, and the system doesn't permit of it anyway.
Our time has flown
by. And David
by.
knows that perfectly well.
Well, he's not writing that. If he knows it, he's not. He's writing something else.
He also didn't please don't you or any of your viewers misunderstand what I'm about to say as negative about David Frum. He's a very fine man and a brilliant man and a dear friend. But when he went all the way down the line for Hillary Clinton, and then after the election wrote that he was never prouder of his vote than on that day after she'd lost, he put an awful lot of blue water between himself and the Republican Party.
You may be overstating it a tad. I don't think he relished voting for Hillary Clinton.
He
I think
said
he did
after
so
the fact that he was
reluctantly.
proud of having done it.
Well,
but I mean, look, these are conscientious things. He does it as he sees it, and that's fine. But he is in a very odd position. He's a party of one,
Well, today.
Yeah.
Let's finish up on this. Time goes so fast, and we've had a lot of it, but time goes too fast here. If you were advising Justin Trudeau right now on how to handle this man you have known for a quarter century, what would you tell him?
I've known Justin a while too. Just be mindful of the correlation of forces, but you can start from the premise that Donald Trump has nothing but goodwill for Canada. And he is not full of any misgivings about the trade agreement with Canada as it applies to Canada. So I think all of that can be smoothed quite well. And on the energy side, all this business about carbon taxes, obviously the ministers of the government responsible for these things and the Prime Minister can figure out the dangers of getting too great a disparity in the cost of gasoline and home fuel, heating fuel and so forth between Canada and the United States. And I think the carbon tax is a very dodgy proposition given what Donald's going to do to energy prices in that country and to some degree in the world as he increases American production and reduces American imports.
But when you see our foreign minister meeting with Rex Tillerson and saying things like, if you guys start a trade war with us, we're punching back. What do you think?
Did Chrystia say that?
She did.
I think she had better be careful to signal to Mr. Tillerson that, as he would be aware, some of these things are said for domestic consumption and he shouldn't take them too seriously. I mean, obviously, if the Americans do something oppressive, we will do our best to punch back. But it is not on that basis that we want to conduct relations with that country under any regime in Washington.
Conrad Black, let's not wait 10 and a half years before we do this again, okay?
I'll come back, as I've never declined an invitation from you, Stephen.
Indeed, indeed. And we remind everybody your latest is called Backward Glances, People and Events from Inside and Out. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Nice to see you again.
You too.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.